This week, major cutbacks happening at local daily and weekly newspapers across the country. These are tough times for many community papers. What happened to create this? What has been lost? And is there a solution? We'll ask our guest, former Post-Star editor Ken Tingley, who raises those questions in his new book.
When I retired, I really wanted to kind of impart that message to readers of the importance of newspapers in their community.
Mountain Lake Journal on Mountain Lake PBS is made possible in part by
Northline Utilities creates employment and training opportunities for North Country residents with projects that build community and social infrastructure. We're family-focused and education-oriented. Power is our business and pride is our choice.
Northern Insuring, guiding your way since 1930, with offices in Plattsburgh, Glens Falls, and Potsdam, providing personal insurance, business insurance, and life and employee benefit services.
Hudson Headwaters Health Network, providing primary care throughout the North Country for more than 40 years. Together, we're building healthier communities. Visit us online at hhhn.org.
Twin State Technologies. The cyber threat tempo, including ransomware, is real. Twin State Technologies provides trusted, innovative services that replace, augment, or update your existing system. Our goal is to stop hacking before it starts. Implementing big business solutions geared for the small business market. Twin State Technologies. Connect, protect, respond. More at twinstate.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Mountain Lake Journal. I'm Tom Halleck. This week, we are going to spend the full half hour looking at the state of the newspaper industry and how dramatic cutbacks have decimated newspapers here in our region and across the country, and the impact those cuts are having on local journalism in our communities. As daily and weekly newspapers across the country downsize, cut back on editions, or even close altogether, who is going to step up to fill the void? To keep communities informed, hold their public officials accountable, and delve into critical issues impacting the community. In other words, who's going to do what newspaper journalists and editors have been doing for generations? That is the question asked by Ken Tingley, the former editor of the Post-Star newspaper in Glens Falls, in his new book, The Last American Newspaper, an institution in peril through the eyes of a small-town editor. Ken, welcome. It's nice to see you.
Well, thank you. It's really great to be here. You know, it was a throwback coming up the Northway again from those years when I was working at the Press Republican, and I lived in Connecticut, and I would come back and forth up the Northway, and I really forgot what a nice drive it is, as long as the sun's out. But you know, the snow, the mountains, and all that stuff. So that was really a nice pleasure and kind of a throwback to the old days.
A lot of people may not know that one of your first jobs, sports reporter at the Press Republican, very early 1980s.
Yeah, Jim Dinko hired me there. Bob Getz was the sports editor. I worked for 2.5 years there. I covered a lot of maybe some of the worst times in Plattsburgh State basketball history. They had some of the worst teams for Norm Law, and it wasn't his fault, just the talent wasn't there. But yeah, I enjoyed that time. My big joke about Plattsburgh says, well, I used to tell people I really enjoy the summers there, both days.
So from Plattsburgh on to the Daily Star in Oneonta for about 5 years, and then to the Post-Star in Glens Falls, first as the sports editor.
Yeah, 11 years.
And then the managing editor for 20 years, from 1999 to 2020 when you retired.
Right.
You now write a newsletter, The Front Page, 3 days a week, essentially an online column.
Right.
You've also written 2 books since you retired. The first, a collection of many of your favorite columns and stories and the people you met and covered during your days at the paper. And then the second book that looks at the major changes happening at local daily and weekly newspapers across the country. And really, these are tough times for community newspapers.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it's one of the things that I saw very clearly in my last few years. It became more and more difficult to do the kind of stories you wanted to do, and you were faced with more and more pressing problems, and you were dealing with layoffs, and it really was a very, very difficult time. And when I retired, I really wanted to kind of impart that message to readers of the importance of newspapers in their community. And I wanted to do that by showing, over those 21 years that I was editor, the great stories that our staff did that benefited the community and made it a better place to live, and how important that was. And I really believe that the readers probably forgot some of those stories along the way. In looking back, I think it was a reminder of how valuable the work was, and how dedicated the people were, the editors and reporters that I worked with. And that was especially disconcerting, you know, in recent years, where you heard the chants of the fake news and enemies of the people and things like that. And that just wasn't the case in local newspapers, and I did want to remind people of that.
In the early 2000s, papers were doing great.
Yes.
You had full staffs. You mentioned you had a staff of nearly 50 people in those days. Advertising was great. You were selling ads, and papers were sailing right along, and it allowed you to do a lot of in-depth reporting, a lot of projects that you tackled in the Glens Falls area.
Yeah, that was the most important thing to me, was to get stories that made a difference in our little corner of the world. We had a young reporter who was following the whole civil unions issue in Vermont in 2000, 2001. And, you know, that was very controversial in Vermont. The Rutland Herald was weighing in on it, you know, and they eventually won a Pulitzer for it. But he wrote a story called Growing Up Gay in the North Country. And it was a story where he talked directly to people who had grown up and what it was like growing up in small, little communities all around our area, where you were a little bit different and you didn't have role models and nobody was talking about homosexuality. It was a very important story from that, of kind of starting the conversation. And I remember probably getting some of the worst, most vile letters to the editor that we ever got. Over a 2 or 3 week period, they just kept coming and coming. And then something strange happened. We started getting letters to the editor from people thanking us for the coverage, for saying, you know, yes, we need to talk about this. We need to talk about people. Now these people have a voice. It's important that you're now giving them that voice. Now, it would be another 9 years before Roy McDonald, one of our local state senators, provides a key vote that passes same-sex marriage in New York State. It took 9 years. And you say, well, the conversation took 9 years to happen. That's how slow things can happen. But go take it a step forward. It was just this past year that they did it on a federal level. So now it's 20 years for that conversation. And I'd like to think that we were at the forefront of at least having the community have the conversation and kind of get it out of its system.
And 20 years later, this is hard to believe now, but in 2002, 2001, 2002, a picture that you ran on the front page was highly controversial, 2 men kissing.
Yes.
And at that time, though, that was part of the reason you heard so much from
Well,
the
yeah,
community.
Absolutely. And I remember going to our publisher with it and saying, listen, this is the picture we have. And it was in a romantic setting where they shoot weddings in Saratoga Springs. And it was of 2 men about to kiss. And, you know, and I wrote in the paper, you know, so what's wrong with, you know, a couple kissing? Well, they're both men. And that did send people out. You know, they were criticizing us of you're pushing a gay agenda. I remember getting one phone call and the woman said, now I have to explain homosexuality to my 12-year-old. And I was like, well, is that the worst thing? I mean, I think that's sometimes that's what newspapers are there for. That's part of the conversation too.
You mentioned in 2011, that's when the state legalized same-sex marriage. Roy McDonald, a key vote. Andrew Cuomo had to line up.
And a conservative's conservative.
Yes. In Roy McDonald's case, it ultimately cost him his seat, didn't it?
Yeah, and that was, again, another part of the book as well, in that it did end up costing him his seat. He did the right thing. Even in 2011, the newspaper had never taken a stand on same-sex marriage. And right before that vote, as it was coming up, we finally did take a stand on same-sex marriage and came out in favor of it. And what was, I think, really disheartening to Roy was how the people who had embraced him, who were his people, who were his constituents, they turned on him.
And you mentioned the paper did an editorial on
Yep.
gay marriage. You would point to that and say that's what newspapers have done well for decades. They would take editorial positions and get it out there in the community. They would take the tough stands that a lot of people, politicians sometimes wouldn't take.
Yeah, I think it was always there. People would always be, if they didn't agree to it, say, why are you doing that? Why are you telling me what to think? And it's like, well, we're not telling you what to think. We're telling you what we think. And we're going to give you reasons for it. We're going to give you the pro and con of it to a certain degree. But you said, but this is the way we think it should come down. And this is all part of the conversation. The fact that people, go ahead, write us a letter to the editor, disagree with us, tell us what you think. That's fine. We don't have a problem with that at all. That's what our mission is on this. You know, we would have it the same thing when we endorse political candidates. I mean, it was, people would say, oh, you know, you shouldn't be telling people how to vote. Well, we're not telling you how to vote. We have the opportunity to sit down with a candidate for 30 minutes to an hour, talk to them face to face, and really learn who they are, what's behind them, how smart they are, and come away with an idea of this is the best person for the job. And it wasn't about politics or even necessarily positions, and often that would be the case. We say, well, we don't necessarily agree with this position on some of these things, but we think this is the best person for the job.
And are papers getting away from that now? Many papers don't endorse political candidates anymore. Are fewer and fewer papers doing editorials even these days?
Yeah, no, they are getting away from it. And because of this political divide in the country, I think a lot of papers have shied away from it. They say, we're losing business. We lose advertisers, we lose readers, and we can't afford that anymore. So their solution, which I don't think is the right solution, is to just not do it. And that is not a good thing, because if the local newspaper doesn't address the problems, it doesn't point out these issues to its community, who does?
In the mid-2000s, early 2000s, as we said, you had a good-sized staff. You were doing these in-depth reports on gay rights, on domestic abuse, on important local issues.
Right.
What happened? Was it that we hit first the recession and the papers had to start cutting back, and then we got into this era of smartphones and devices and people being able to get their news right at their fingertips 24/7? What happened?
Yeah, I think you first and foremost always have to remember that the newspaper business is a business. It's there to make money. Now, that said, you know, I later learned in the 1990s and up into the 2000s was some of the most lucrative revenue times for newspapers and probably all sorts of media. We had classified advertising, we had retail advertising, we had circulation. In fact, they didn't even really care that much about circulation. That's why the newspaper was 25 cents for so long, and then 50 cents for so long. Now is what, $3 or something like that? Yeah. And because they didn't need that revenue, because they were getting so much from a thing. So there was a lot of things. There was a confluence, I think, of a lot of things that it really affected the business thing, and everything from the rise of Amazon, which affected retail stores. Retail stores would advertise in the newspaper. The trickle down effect on that. Certainly, you know, phones came around, but I don't think that was certainly the thing that was the death knell, or websites or whatever. I think people still kind of would rather hold a newspaper in their hand. But what happened was, certainly in the case of my newspaper, and I think many others, they got into debt. They bought a lot of newspapers. Lee Enterprises bought a chain called Pulitzer for $1 billion and put it all on the credit card. Now, they were trying to pay us X number of millions a year to do that, and to keep paying down their debt, and they were really adamant about doing it. That's what you're supposed to do, right? And to do that, though, as things went along, well, they had to lay off a certain amount of staff each year, and so the staffs kept getting smaller and smaller. You know, we would react. We would do 1 or 2 huge projects a year, then it got down to 1. And then, maybe not even 1, or instead of doing an entire staff project, it was 2 or 3 people, and then 1 person doing these projects. So the journalism was hurt all along the way.
And we're seeing that. Large groups are buying up newspapers across the country.
Yeah.
A lot of newspapers are now controlled by really large groups.
Yeah, without a doubt. The business model is broken. Revenues are just keep going down.
Yep.
And I mean, I think that's not only true for us, but it's probably true for all media, whether it's TV or radio or who have you. And that's the concern. It's one of the reasons, in the book, it's called, the Last American Newspaper. It isn't about the Glens Falls newspaper per se. We're a metaphor for what's happening to all the newspapers in the country. And a reminder, you have to support that media, and that you need to be aware that in these places, as these resources dwindle, you're going to see less people voting, you're going to see less community engagement, and you're going to see your taxes go up because there's going to be nobody to hold the politicians accountable.
And we're seeing across the country newspaper deserts, areas where small dailies, weeklies have gone out of business, and folks aren't getting any news. And now, and I think the estimate was about 25%, but maybe as much as a third of the country might see this within the next few years.
Yeah, I think it was already up to 20%, and you may be right. It may be getting closer up to a third because, now that you're having newspapers, there's a lot of new models out there. There's a nonprofit model.
Yeah.
One of our former publishers is doing that out in Missouri. There's a guy down in Saratoga Springs who has an online news site who's getting a subscription, $36 for a year of news, and he's starting to get. So I think what you're seeing is that people have to realize where you used to get everything under one newspaper and your one product, the postcard come to your door, you're set. You had the national, regional, state, everything in one package. Well, you're not going to get that anymore. There's just not enough staffing to do that. So you may have to not only get a subscription to your local newspaper, whether it's Plattsburgh or Glens Falls, but maybe the Times-Union to get the state on the state legislature. Maybe in the New York Times to get more of a world view, or the Wall Street Journal. Something like that. And then the little papers, the small weeklies, and these digital startups, they're going to play a bigger and bigger role. The taxes in my town went up 56% recently. I didn't find out about it in my local newspaper. I found out from a digital startup in Saratoga Springs. And it shows the ramifications something like that has. In the old days, if we had written a story about taxes going up 50%, people would have turned out en masse at the next meeting. They would have complained. They would have been calling their town councilman, their supervisor. That didn't happen because there was no coverage. So that just passed right through. So, now granted, that's only $50, $60 off of my tax bill, but will they do it again next year and the year after that? And next thing you know, it's $200, $300, $400 more a year, for someone on a fixed income.
You mentioned the nonprofits. Are they filling the void? Are they able to do what the newspapers did for so many years?
I don't think they're there yet. I think they're part of the solution. And as I said, it's almost like you're going to have to put together, it's like a coalition. You're going to need a media coalition. And it's really hard to imagine people thinking that out through. Sometimes it just comes down to they're going to have to realize that if they want to be a good citizen, they're going to have to pay for a lot more of this news. People say, well, I don't want to pay. I can get it for free on Facebook. Well, how much do you pay for your phone every month? How much do you pay for your cable TV bill? Why not pay that for what your media choices, for 2 or 3 different subscriptions so that you're an informed person who can vote appropriately?
When you left, you mentioned that the staff was way down from only about a quarter or less of what you had.
Down to about 10, by about a quarter,
And so that had to be disheartening as you walked out the door to see what had become of the paper.
Well, it has, and it was part of the reason why I left. I had to lay off 4 people the day after the election day, which I always thought was a terrible idea, in 2020. And I went home and told my wife, I said, I'm never doing that again. I said, the next person outdoors is going to be me. I really made that choice that this might be in the best interest of saving someone else's job down the road. So it was difficult, and it continues to be difficult to see the lack of coverage on things. Not only just the basic coverage, but obviously the in-depth coverage, which we really blazed the trail and made a name for ourselves statewide.
You won a Pulitzer in 2009.
Won a Pulitzer in 2009 for Mark Mahoney. We won 9 Newspaper of the Year awards for our circulation size while we were there. So we were known for doing great work. And, that's what, the book, The Last American Newspaper, it really tells those stories of the people they did. It isn't so much my story, it's their story of how they did it and, what an impact that made.
You talked to a lot of the reporters who covered those stories. But at the same time, you and Will Doolittle, your editorials were also year after year after year honored in New York State. So you were winning accolades for your editorials and your editorial writing as well. And again, that is lost.
Again, it comes back to that, if the newspaper doesn't point out the problems, well, who does? It isn't going to happen on Facebook or word of mouth, except in very small type things. So if we had found out, we were still there and we found out that Queensbury taxes were going up 56%, we would have written an editorial. And it probably would not have been in favor of taxes going up 56% unless they had a really good reason. And I haven't heard what that really good reason is. That would have been, I think, a call for people to say, well, I didn't know that. And then it starts being talked about. And maybe there's a reaction, maybe there's not.
The Poynter Institute, a journalism think tank in St. Petersburg, Florida, in describing your book, says it should be a wake-up call to people of what's happening and what's at stake. And they call on people like you do to do something about it.
Yeah, and people ask me all the time, well, what should I do? Well, I said, you need to open your wallet and pay for, but I hear of all the time people saying, wow, the subscription to the newspaper costs $250 a year now, and I don't know if I can afford that. Maybe you can get the digital subscription. I know you like to hold the paper in your hand, but there's a digital subscription. That's a lot cheaper. You're going to have more subscriptions. Maybe you need to be a better citizen and get out and go to meetings and do those kind of things. People don't have the time and they depended on the newspaper. You'd never hear of public officials bringing up this problem, because they always, we don't want them to be that kind of scrutiny because it gums up the work sometimes, slows down the process if I'm trying to get something through that's controversial or I'm trying to spend some money that people might not agree with. But it is so important to have that, oversight. And, and maybe some of it's, people get involved as freelance pay. There's got to be better models out there. Some of these nonprofit newspapers are interesting because local community leaders, the movers and shakers, will get together and raise $5 or $6 million as kind of the core to start up a nonprofit newspaper. And they sell advertising just like a regular newspaper, but they don't have to make a profit. Well, when you don't have to hit that 20%, 30% margin for profit, that gives you the ability to hire a few more reporters and editors.
Is part of what's happening a growing distrust of newspapers and reporters?
Well, I think there certainly was some of that, and especially when we were called enemies of the paper and fake news was suddenly and that trickled down. We had one supervisor, small town. They had a controversy where they were criticizing the local recreation department, and our reporter covered and wrote the quotes up and published in the paper, and people in the recreation department got very angry and criticized them. Why are you saying all these things? And they said, oh, we didn't say any of that. This is all fake news. This is all made up. The reporter made up all these quotes. Well, the reporter was a really good reporter, and her first reaction was, don't they know they tape record their meetings? And she went back and she found exactly the points in the tape and showed them to the people in the recreation department and said, and we wrote an editorial then saying, the only thing newspapers and reporters and editors have is our credibility. And you're trying to take away our credibility by accusing us of lying when we didn't lie. When we make a mistake, we correct it and we take responsibility for it. You should correct this mistake. Well, we never heard a word. They never apologized to the reporter. They never got on the record publicly and said, yeah, we lied. That's the world we live in, and if we weren't there to correct that, then it would have been the newspaper just would have been to blame. It would have been the scapegoat.
You talk about at the end of the book how even though as you wrapped up and you retired and maybe not the way that you had hoped that you would retire, that you were grateful for being able to live what you called a charmed life. How lucky you were to be able to do what you did for 30 years.
Yeah, my son and my wife would ask me, well, when do you think you'll retire? And I said, I can't ever imagine retiring. Why would I want to retire? This has been the job where you were always happy to get out of the bed in the morning and go to work. Every day was different. Every day was exciting. You got to meet different people. And sure, there were tough times and there were horrible things. And I went to the funeral of the 6 little kids after that fire. Those are terrible things. But you're also contributing to the grieving process of the community. You're being part of the community and an important part, I think. So I enjoyed every second of that and couldn't imagine running away. And I loved writing my columns. I got to meet regular people every day that were just inspirational.
Both you and Will Doolittle, former editor,
yes,
are both writing weekly columns.
Yep.
How can folks subscribe to the columns?
If you search Ken Tingley, one word, .substack, SUBSTACK.com, and that'll come up. You just put in your email address and it'll automatically come to you 3 times a week in your email under the front page. It's called the front page.
And the books, both The Last American Editor and The Last American Newspaper, where can folks find those?
Well, certainly you can get them on Amazon. Certainly down in the Glens Falls area, we have a number of outlets down there. My best store is Ace Hardware in Queensbury. Unbelievable. Everybody buys books at Ace Hardware in Queensbury. But certainly the Chapman Museum and a variety of places. But certainly from around here, you can get it on Amazon.
Ken Tingley, thank you so much for taking the time to come see us. We appreciate it.
This has been great. I enjoyed it a lot.
Mountain Lake Journal on Mountain Lake PBS is made possible in part by
Northfind Utilities creates employment and training opportunities for North Country residents with projects that build community and social infrastructure. We're family-focused and education-oriented. Power is our business and pride is our choice.
Northern Insuring, guiding your way since 1930, with offices in Plattsburgh, Glens Falls, and Potsdam, providing personal insurance, business insurance, and life and employee benefit services.
Hudson Headwaters Health Network, providing primary care throughout the North Country for more than 40 years. Together, we're building healthier communities. Visit us online at hhhn.org.
Twin State Technologies. The cyber threat tempo, including ransomware, is real. Twin State Technologies provides trusted, innovative services that replace, augment, or update your existing system. Our goal is to stop hacking before it starts. Implementing big business solutions geared for the small business market. Twin State Technologies. Connect, protect, respond. More at twinstate.com.
And that's going to do it for this week for Mountain Lake Journal. I'd like to thank my guest, Ken Tingley. For all of us at Mountain Lake PBS, I'm Tom Halleck. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.